Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Cameron. I'm studying political science and international relations, and I did my Keystone underneath Professor Perez from the political science department. So my Keystone is entitled Europe's Democratic Illness, the Effect of COVID-19 on Democratic Erosion in Poland and Hungary. So for my Keystone, I conducted a comparative policy analysis of different European countries' responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. I wanted to see if countries in Europe that were already engaging in democratic erosion, for the purpose of this paper, Poland and Hungary, responded differently to the outbreak of the pandemic than more stable democracies in Europe. For this paper, Spain, France, and Italy. So just for a bit of background at first, what is democratic erosion? Democratic erosion is the gradual undermining of democracy, oftentimes by elected leaders. This can happen through executive aggrandizement, which is where an elected head of state uses oftentimes legal channels to slowly diminish the checks on their power. So this can be accomplished through the undermining of the judiciary, the implementation of state control over the media, as well as the weakening of the legitimacy of elections. So this has been a trend that has been observed around the world, and now the majority of people actually live in autocracies as opposed to democracies. So why does this matter? Oftentimes, democratic erosion can lead to a severe undermining of fundamental human rights within democratically eroding countries, and oftentimes this targets minority populations within those countries. So for my paper, I specifically want to look at Poland and Hungary. So before the outbreak of the pandemic in Hungary, the democratic erosion process started in 2010 with the election of the Fidesz party. This was underneath Prime Minister Orbán, and in 2013, they rewrote the Hungarian constitution. This included developments that severely limited the independence of the judiciary, consolidated the media under a single state-owned conglomerate, as well as allowed for increased government corruption with the allocation of funding to party loyalists. Furthermore, this had significant violations of civil rights, oftentimes targeting women and refugees within the country. In Poland, the democratic erosion process started with the rise of the PiS, or the Law and Justice Party, underneath President Duda and Chairman Kaczynski. So in 2015, they came to power following the refugee crisis in Europe, and they frequently undermined the judiciary, forcing judges not loyal to the party into early retirement and replacing them instead with party loyalists. Similar to Hungary, although not to the same extent, they undermined the independence of the media, replacing editors with sources much more favorable towards the government. So following the 2015 refugee crisis, there were significant attacks on refugees and foreigners within Poland. They've also severely undermined women's rights within the country, and there has been extreme cases of homophobia, even with the establishment of LGBTQ-free zones throughout the country. So I wanted to specifically look at the pandemic as an opportunity for democratic erosion. This is because during emergencies such as pandemics, states oftentimes implement a state of emergency. This allows for the normal suspension of checks against executive power in order to streamline decision-making processes, so much less checking in with Congress or with the parliament in order to allow for decisions to be made much more quickly. So there are examples of legitimate states of emergency, and this includes set time limits on how long the state of emergency can last, or regularly checking in with the parliament. So for these examples, I looked at Spain, Italy, and France, which all had these regular check-ins or time limits on the state of emergency. However, the literature indicates that countries already engaging in democratic erosion are much more likely to use emergencies to further erode. So this was certainly the case in Hungary during the pandemic. Most concerningly, for a prolonged period of time, Orbán was allowed to rule by decree. There was no set end time for this, so basically from March 2020 to June of 2020, he could make any decree he wanted without parliamentary checks. This was eventually ended in June 2020 after a large international outcry. However, during this time, he made dozens of decrees, and some of them had very little to do with the pandemic. These decrees also were not just temporary measures. Some of them represented permanent changes to Hungary's fundamental law. For example, they introduced legislation that outlawed disinformation against the government and could possibly imprison people for going against public health measures. However, the language of these laws was written broadly enough that many activists are concerned they can be used to imprison journalists and activists in the future. Furthermore, the Fidesz party used this opportunity to take away funding from opposition districts. This was particularly observed in Budapest, which was headed by an opposition party. So they removed all the funding for those districts and instead pumped the money into districts that have party loyalists instead. Additionally, under the guise of the pandemic, they changed the electoral law in Hungary. So now it takes much higher qualifications for parties to even get on the ballot to oppose Fidesz. So the elections, while they're still being held, it's much harder for opposition parties to even qualify for them. Furthermore, they violently cracked down on civil society. So they allowed for protests on the far right to continue without a problem throughout the country. However, when there were protests on the left, they violently cracked down on these protests under the guise of public health restrictions. So in Poland, there was also significant democratic erosion, although not to the extent that was observed in Hungary. So during this time, Poland attempted to hold their presidential election in the middle of a lockdown. They attempted to justify this by saying people could vote by mail instead of attending in person. However, this goes against their previous constitution rulings about when you're allowed to change elections, how far out from the election. And President Duda also took advantage of this by being the only person who was allowed to campaign during this time as opposed to the opposition parties. Additionally, Poland passed an abortion law that received international attention. Poland already had the most restrictive abortion laws within Europe. However, this was a near complete ban on abortion in the country. And this was met by very strong civil unrest in Poland. However, the state violently cracked down on it, saying it's violating public health regulations. So why are these policy differences observed in Hungary and Poland? So Hungary was able to further democratically erode during the pandemic. This was because Fidesz has been in power longer and they have a much stronger majority within the country than PIS has in Poland. Furthermore, there was more EU pushback on Poland, whereas they're held to a higher standard than Hungary is when it comes to violating laws usually. And furthermore, Poland also has a much stronger civil society that was able to more effectively protest these regulations. The long-term implications of this paper, democratic erosion is a very gradual process and it's difficult to effectively combat. This paper indicates that a strong civil society and a strong EU response are both very effective at mitigating these effects of democratic erosion and should therefore be considered in the future. Thank you.
So, questions for Cameron?
So if you could expand the scope of this project, whether that be to look at more countries in the EU or to look deeper into certain aspects of Hungary and Poland, is there anything that you would want to explore that you feel like you didn't get the chance to do within the scope of this project, since it's, such a short time frame that you're working on?
Yeah, I would probably like to dive a bit more deeply into Spain, Italy, and France because I use them in a more comparative sense, but I would love to be able to do the same amount of deep dive because with Poland and Hungary, I also talk about the origins of the party and how this resulted from the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. So I'd really like to be able to bring more of that historical context into the background analysis as well.
So I was wondering what your impressions were of social media in both countries and how that was or was not used by the government, changes and so forth.
Yeah, sure. So in Hungary and Poland, oftentimes with the public health measures, they took a lot of their civil protests online. So it was used as a pretty decent way of protesting the government. In terms of government suppression, the control of social media is a bit less solidified than their control over print media. So there's always that opportunity to protest the government as well.
Cameron? So just one more. So are there other topics that might be interesting? You mentioned possibly an expansion into Spain, France, and Italy, but I remember thinking, what other sorts of things that would bother the government might people be interested in, or governments interested in cracking down on and limiting? You mentioned abortion, for example. Other things that you didn't get to investigate but came up?
In both countries, they've had significant targeting of ethnic minorities. A lot of times that was through the refugee crisis that happened in 2015 with Europe. But I would like to examine more of the refugee aspect of it because I focused a bit more on the abortion law in Poland in particular.
Okay, if there are no further questions, please join me in thanking Cameron for a great talk.